Good afternoon. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Marwan Awatani and our hosts USAID and Amadis and everyone who's organized this conference. It's been very interesting so far, and I've appreciated participating as a listener as well as being able to speak here. I've been asked to speak about assessment and creativity. I can tell you that for more than a decade, I've worked on assessment issues and program evaluation in different countries around the world. And I can say that across countries, this is one of the most challenging areas in policy, in research, and in practice. And assessment of creativity is particularly challenging. So, why are we talking about creativity at all? Of course, it's the focus of this conference, but I can tell you that it's also a buzzword. We're hearing creativity in conferences, in literature, everything and published on education these days for 21st century learning is about creativity in education. But it is, even though it's a buzzword, it's an important area. It's vital for economic and social innovation, and it's also vital for individual well-being. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, for example, she's one of the individuals who helped develop the United Nations Human Development Index. Okay. Martha Nussbaum helped develop the Human Development Index, tracking well-being across the world. She argues that human dignity and progress are rooted in each individual's capabilities, including those that are central to creativity. That's being able to use the senses, imagine, think, and reason, and to have the educational opportunities necessary to realize these capabilities. Let's see, we're a couple of, okay. So creativity has become a major education policy in countries across the world. You'll find it across countries in Europe and Australia, the US, Canada, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and evidently, it's an important issue here in Palestine as well. In spite of this international interest, there is no widely shared definition of creativity in education policy. Is it only about the arts? Does it also apply to science? If it's a priority, what does it mean for how subjects are taught, for how the curriculum is developed? These things haven't been addressed in the policy world. There are also significant challenges for assessment of open learning. Open learning is a term that I've coined with another colleague to contrast it to closed learning. Closed learning is the kind of thing that Dr. Awatani spoke about this morning, where the answer's at the back of the textbook. We know where to find it, we just need to memorize it. Open learning is where the answer is unknown, and so that's a major assessment challenge here. We don't know how to assess necessarily work where the answer isn't at the back of the textbook, and we need to find some way to decide if it's good or not. It's also important to note that some forms of assessment have the potential to undermine creativity. Should creative works be assessed at all? Or do we risk killing creativity if we try to assess it? Since I've noted that definitions are important, I'd like to talk about some of the concepts and definitions that people have developed to talk about creativity. One thing that is really important to note here is that this is really an emerging field, and when we look at the research on creativity, I think most of it really is about arguing about concepts, definitions, finding out how we should think about creativity, and the research is really quite new. So this morning, is this working? This morning, Paul Collard talked about big C creativity, the big C being the geniuses, the gifted and talented. That's also contrasted with small c creativity. That's everyday creativity, the kind that most of us have, where you're there to solve problems. Early on in the research on creativity, the focus really was on identifying who was gifted. So most assessment was focused on figuring out how to identify those gifted students so they could be separated out and put in special programs and all their talents nurtured, and they could really fly high. They develop tests like divergent thinking. Could you come up with some really unique and interesting ideas? And also how many different unique ideas you could come up with in a short time. The thinking has evolved since then. We don't really think so much about the number of ideas because it was realized that you can come up with a lot of really bad ideas in a short period of time. That's not being creative. It's not a sign of giftedness. Divergent thinking is still important, however. More recently, the focus has been on dispositions. This is going a little faster than I am. So this is a bit of a repetition of what you've heard as well, too. We're looking at what are the characteristics of people who are particularly creative, and how can we nurture these in other learners? Because if we see creativity as something that's small c and not big C, if we see it as something that can be nurtured and supported in every learner, then we can find ways to do that in classrooms. One thing that people say, though, is that you can't teach people to be creative. You can only nurture it. What we see in the research on creative dispositions is that it focuses on personality variables, cognitive variables, creative self-efficacy, and your social participation. So the kinds of things that we've heard about already, openness to experiences, curiosity, ability to tolerate ambiguity is one of my favorite ones because I think that is something that's hard for a lot of people and hard for a lot of young learners. And we don't hear that one a lot, but it is essential for creativity. Cognitive and affective variables, effort and persistence. We keep hearing a lot about persistence, and this is something that's been increasingly seen as important in education research. How many people here have heard of the research on mindset from Carol Dweck? Just one person. Okay. The mindset research is about how different students approach their education. So most people, and young students too, have an idea that intelligence, talent, creativity is a fixed trait, that you've either got it or you haven't got it. Mindset is the idea that you can develop your capacities. That you've got a growth mindset means that if you persist and you work hard enough, you can reach your goals. What the research shows is that the people who have a growth mindset over the long term succeed more than those who see themselves as particularly talented. In fact, people who see themselves as being particularly talented might freeze when they're given something that they don't succeed at. They might then find, I'm just not as good as I thought I was, I'm never going to do anything. Because they haven't learned a growth mindset, they don't succeed. For creativity, this is particularly important. In addition, of course, we've got the ability to generate different ideas. Divergent thinking is still important. To question, reflect critically, and to synthesize ideas from diverse sources. This synthesis of ideas is also an important aspect of creativity, the ability to interconnect and put things together. Creative self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is something that's really important too. It's quite different than self-esteem. I know that, for example, in the United States where I'm from, self-esteem is getting a bad rap these days for probably some good reasons, because kids are told that they're great no matter what. Self-efficacy is focusing really on what they're doing and giving students the confidence that they can address problems. Thank you. That even if they don't know the answer already, that they know that they can tackle the problem and find a way to address it. Creative self-efficacy means that you're able to know that you're going to be able to find not just any solution, but be able to do that in an interesting way. And then active participation in social networks. This has been recently identified as important. There's not a wide body of research on this, but this is pretty interesting. There was one study using data mining techniques that looked at people's social networks and then asked those people to report on their own level of creativity. And they found a correlation between those people who self-identified as being creative, who had broader social networks, that the higher your social network score was, also the higher your self-reported creativity was. So the idea that creativity really is about collaboration and not the lone genius in the tower seems to be playing out here. Creative processes. This kind of research is closely related to that on dispositions, but it's a little bit different. This is trying to look at what people do when they're creative to really support an effective process. So not surprisingly, they're exploratory. They're analytical, because we think of creativity not just about the arts, but about the sciences and the mathematics. But you can be analytical in the arts as well. Again, you're able to bring together ideas, and importantly, you're able to evaluate them. That's because we see assessment is actually an important part of creativity. Creative individuals are good problem solvers, and they can do that in different domains. Here's an important issue, I think. Creativity in any given domain entails deep knowledge and the capacity to assess and structure that knowledge. To me, this means that some of the traditional teaching that we're familiar with is still important. The professor's role in deciding how to put together knowledge so that it can spur insights is really essential. So sometimes that comes through lectures, sometimes it's in the course design, but that is a key role for the professor. And it's a key pedagogical challenge as well. Another area that's really interesting is that the harder the challenge, the more you're likely to call on learners' ability to be creative and to find new ways to address those challenges. Another thing that's quite important here is on domain knowledge. Whether creativity in one area, such as the arts, can translate into another area. So is creativity just a general skill? If you're a creative person, will you be creative when you take your science classes? Will you be creative when you paint? What we know so far is that it tends to be more domain specific. There are some aspects of creativity that are domain general, but there are also domain specific areas. So each discipline has important challenges to think about how to nurture creativity within their discipline to develop specific skills for problem solving in that discipline. It could even go into sub-parts of the discipline. So for example, being creative in poetry is not the same as being creative in short story writing. So these things need to be thought through very carefully. It's actually quite challenging trying to set up a classroom where you can be creative. And then finally, there's the question of creative work and how to assess that. Experts agree that if you want to see something as creative, it's novel, appropriate to the task in hand, and it's high quality compared to some reference group. It could be aesthetically pleasing, for example, or it could answer a question in a way that's simple and direct. What we find in schools, and I think probably in universities, particularly in large classes, is that for a variety of reasons, teachers and professors are reluctant to judge the quality of creative work. Maybe they don't want to shut down learner creativity. Maybe they feel that it's gone outside the bounds of the closed learning system that they want to teach. But it is something that's quite challenging, and there aren't a lot of assessment tools to do that. So now I'm going to shift the conversation radically to get to the other part of the presentation on assessment, and I'll bring these two together later. So you saw a little bit of this, you had a preview on the different kinds of assessment. One of the reasons it's important to look at these different kinds of assessment is, as I said at the beginning, some kinds of assessment have the potential to undermine creativity, and others have the potential to support it. So what are the main kinds of assessment? Summative assessment, as is implied by the word summative, it's a summary judgment. These are tests and examinations that you have at the end of a course, or if you're going to graduate from your year or go on to college and so on and so forth. They may include teacher-developed tests if you're finishing a unit. They could include large-scale standards-based tests, for example, the kind that we use for graduation or university entrance. These kinds of tests are norm-referenced or criterion-referenced. How many people here have heard of those terms, norm-referenced or criterion-referenced? Okay, a few. For those who haven't, norm-referenced is when you're comparing each student's scores to other students in the course. So it's sort of in competition with others in the class. Criterion reference is when you set a standard and you've got your criteria and you're measuring. So that's the criterion referenced. More and more, some of the major large-scale tests are criterion references. People set up standards in central curriculum and so on. But that's fairly new. It's only in the last decade or so that large-scale tests have been criterion referenced. Formative assessment. You've heard this term a few times. I'll talk a little bit more depth about that. Since we've just talked about criterion referenced, I should note that formative assessment is always criterion referenced. It's about Setting the learning goal. It could be a sub-goal that you're doing inside a class when you have a specific teaching goal. Finding out where the learner is, and identifying the gap, and then deciding how to adjust your teaching and learning strategy in order to close that gap. So that's the formative part. You're responding, you're reacting, and you're being formative. You're not being summary, you're being formative. It can include classroom-based dialogue. So in the process of talking with students, you get to reveal what they do and don't understand. This could be kind of the Socratic dialogue method where you're asking questions, but you're not asking just yes-no questions. You're asking deep questions that can reveal misconceptions. You're going into student projects and looking at what they've done and providing feedback. The focus is on improvement, as has been said. The feedback is most effective when it's timely. What we know from the research is that it can be on the fly, as we say, so from 2 seconds up to 2 weeks. But after 2 weeks, if you're giving feedback, it tends to not be effective. Everything's been forgotten. It's task-focused. So as we were saying before, self-efficacy is different than self-esteem. And when you're task-focused, you're focused on what the learner needs to do to improve the work, not whether they're a good student or a bad student. This is a really important point, particularly for students who think they're not good learners. When they're focused on the task and not themselves and their identity as a learner, they tend to get better results. And it also includes suggestions for improvement, because just saying to a student, you need to try harder, isn't good enough. You need to help them do that. Again, it's always criterion referenced. Now, this kind of back and forth is very important for creativity because it helps people improve along the way and test their ideas. And it's also helping them develop their own skills for assessment. So this last one is called ipsative assessment. We don't really hear about it that much. Ipsative is a Latin word that refers to self-referenced assessment. So this is the kind of thing where you're tracking your own improvement, and your reference standard is yourself. It could be portfolios, tracking tools, that kind of thing. So each of these kinds of assessments gathers different kinds of information for different purposes on a different time scale. As I said, some of these have the potential to undermine creativity. I think you can probably imagine which ones they are. So for example, if you have high stakes tests, it's not a given that teachers will teach to the test if they have high stakes, but many times this does happen. And when you have high stakes and they teach to the test, what that means is you're narrowing curriculum, you're focusing on what you think is going to be on the exam. Nothing could be more deadly for creativity in the classroom. Standards-based tests don't necessarily have to do that, but when they're large scale, often we have the standardized tests. And the standardized tests you might be familiar with have the fill in the bubble, and then they're judged. And there's a fly here too. Okay. They're scored by the machine. And these are very important. This is the best technology we have. I think we have the sound engineer here again. This is the best technology we have for judging large groups of students. Because if you want to judge the performance of large groups of students, you want to be sure that the results are valid and reliable. So valid means that they're measuring what they're supposed to measure. Reliable means that you can reproduce the results. But the standardized test is the best technology we have to do that. The problem with that is that we don't have technologies, we don't have measurement technologies, let me say, where you can measure complex skills for a large number of students. So interconnecting ideas, performing tasks, doing things that are open instead of closed learning. We don't have the kind of technology to do that. So these kinds of assessments, if teachers don't have the support they need to go beyond teaching to the test, they could undermine creativity. Another challenge is that we just don't have that many good instruments to measure creativity, whether it is creative dispositions, creative processes, or creative work products. There's a lack of a shared definition of creativity. We don't have clear reference standards for creativity. We might try and find some good reference standards, and that's something I want to talk about, but we don't have clear reference standards to say this is creative or not. And again, because creativity is probably different in different domains. That makes the task very complicated. And then, as we were saying before, some teachers don't want to assess creativity, and they may perceive assessment as all assessment is undermining creativity rather than supporting it. So what happens as a result is that learners receive little guidance on how they might improve or deepen their work when they're trying to engage in open learning. And they're not encouraged to develop their own sense of what counts as high-quality creative work. So here's one tool that's been developed to measure creative dispositions. This was actually commissioned by the OECD and the Center for Creative Education, Paul Collard's group. And yes, you can see it better there. You might recognize these terms here: imaginative, inquisitive, persistent, collaborative, disciplined. These are the kinds of things that I was just talking about in terms of dispositions, and the kinds of things that Paul was mentioning as well. The idea here is that the learner, along with their... I've been asked to slow down. I'm sorry if I'm speaking too quickly. The idea is that teachers and learners are tracking their own development in terms of these dispositions. It's really impossible to set a reference standard to say any particular learner should be at this level of imagination. So the only way to really focus attention on this is through a tracking tool. The idea, too, is to keep that focus, because what happens is if you don't have some way to say this is important, what teachers have said in surveys and so on is that assessment in particular keeps them from being creative in their classrooms, keeps them from encouraging their students to be creative. By having a tool to focus attention, that helps them really not throw it under the rug, but make sure that creativity is a normal part of the classroom. So this has been piloted and tested, and it was actually co-created with teachers, so that they were able to make sense of it and say, this is something I can use in my classroom. Piloted and tested and found to be fairly effective. And I think there are plans to try and do that in more schools. These are, in a way, my recommendations, because I don't think they're really seen as part of the horizon right now on how to assess creativity. But I think it's essential to develop classroom-based formative assessment. What we know is that teachers tend to like formative assessment. It's a concept that resonates for them. They want to do it, but they find that it's difficult to do, and we only see it in some model classrooms around different countries, but we don't see it happening regularly, systematically in classrooms. When teachers start to focus on the quality of the work rather than the learner's ego, whether they're a good learner or not, when they can make suggestions for improvement, and when they support a growth mindset, that can really help creativity.